Hello, it's Shamrocker again. Welcome to the Proud Heretic channel. What happens when a faith system teaches you to distrust your mind, your heart, your conscience, your emotions, and your very human identity? What happens when a person spends years hearing those kinds of messages? One question kept returning about penal substitutionary atonement, or PSA. Now, this is pretty much the stock evangelical doctrine, okay? Non-negotiable. It's part of the gospel. I was taught that God requires us to forgive unconditionally. 70 times 7, to love our enemies, to show mercy, to practice grace. Yet I was also taught that God himself could not simply forgive humanity as he commanded and required us to do. It never made sense to me. But you just keep drinking the Kool-Aid, live with the cognitive dissonance of things that don't make sense, mind screw yourself into believing, well, one day it'll make sense because his thoughts and ways are higher than mine, and so blah-de-blah-de-blah. And so you just continue with the cognitive dissonance. Well, see, I finally just started really questioning that doctrine and how that might have factored in to the hypervigilance and the other religious trauma that I had undergone. So God could not simply forgive. His justice required the death and the murder or the bloodshedding of his son, Jesus. Now, why? Why is that? Well, for years, like I said, I accepted that explanation. I was told it was the orthodox position, To reject that meant you were rejecting the gospel itself. Now, if anything, that spurred me to ask further questions. Says who that it's the orthodox position? I discovered that many early Christians understood the cross in a completely different way. You see, many early Christians understood the cross as primarily God's victory over sin, death, and evil. Now, the idea that Jesus mainly died to absorb God's wrath as punishment for our sins became especially influential much, much later, and not the only way that faithful Christians have understood the cross. Around 1100 CE, Anselm's satisfaction theory took root. It says that God is not primarily punishing Jesus. Through the cross, Christ's divine honor is restored. During the Reformation era, that's when PSA, or the Penal Substitutionary Atonement, became prominent. And the reformers, especially Martin Luther and John Calvin, they began emphasizing something different in the cross. Humanity deserves punishment. God's justice requires punishment, and that Jesus receives that punishment deserved by sinners, by guilty sinners who were born guilty as babies, remember. Now, where did they get all this from? From their time in history, their culture, and their renegotiations of the biblical text in order to suit their doctrinal needs at the time. In truth, that's how all Christians interpreted the Bible, to one degree or another. Whereas for 1,500 years prior, Christians had not understood PSA as the non-negotiable orthodox view. Now, many progressive Christians, Eastern Orthodox, and some Catholics object because they feel that PSA can portray God needing violence before forgiveness, requiring punishment before mercy, or punishing an innocent person instead of the guilty. That's why they often prefer the Christus Victor or the moral example theories of the atonement. Now, growing up, I was taught one way, that Jesus died to absorb God's wrath against my sin because God needed someone to punish, since I was born so bad and so guilty. To believe anything else, as I was taught, was heresy. God could not accept me as I was, but could only look at me or stand to look at me through Jesus. Otherwise, I deserved nothing but eternal hell and misery. Do you understand how damaging that can be to tell a child that? Well, that's what I was told since 10 years old. Now, today, I would regard that as psychological abuse of children. PSA doesn't work for me because I experienced it as a toxic, trauma-inducing teaching. And I discovered that it's not necessary to believe in penal substitutionary atonement in order to be a Christian. In some religious environments, PSA can actually reinforce a framework of self-distrust and chronic self-suspicion. If you are repeatedly taught, your heart is deceitful, your desires are corrupt, your instincts are fallen, you deserve God's wrath. Jesus had to die because of how sinful you are. And your greatest problem is your own wickedness coming from your own heart. You see? Then it's not hard to see how some folks might internalize that and say, I am fundamentally unsafe to trust. My inner world is inherently dangerous. That's a very different message. Asking those questions became a critical part of reclaiming my autonomy.